Welcome back to A World History of Christianity, Chapter 7, Part 2. We are on page 252. Circumstances were very different in the three prosperous lands of Western Europe, where the fate of the Reformation was initially most uncertain: France, England, and the Netherlands. England in this period was a land of contrasts. Much less urbanized than either Germany or the Netherlands, it nevertheless possessed a thriving international trade center in London, and in Oxford and Cambridge, two universities of outstanding reputation. Both, in fact, would play a significant role in the early campaigns against Luther, as Henry VIII turned to their finest theologians for the arguments which allowed him to enter the lists against the growing threat of Lutheran heresy, an initiative which would earn him from a grateful pope the coveted title Defender of the Faith. The progress of the Reformation in England was closely bound up with Henry's personal affairs, as his increasing desperation to secure release from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon forced him to contemplate radical steps which went very much against the grain of his own instinctive theological conservatism. In this respect, the Reformation in England would follow a model much closer to that of Scandinavia than Germany or Switzerland. Although England, like Bohemia, had its own indigenous medieval heresy in Lollardy, Luther's attack on the church produced little resonance in England outside the colony of the German merchants resident in London. Indeed, although Luther's works were clearly important into England at an early stage, this may very often have been for the convenience of conservative theologians who bought them to refute them, such as Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More. All of this changed when Henry made the fateful decision that only drastic action could extricate him from a marriage which, in the absence of a male heir, now threatened the future of his dynasty. In rapid succession from 1532, legislation was passed through Parliament curbing the influence of the papacy in England and appointing the king supreme head of the church. This and the divorce once achieved, the king moved to take control of much of the church's property through the dissolution of the monasteries. The political nation was, for the most part, obediently compliant rather than enthusiastic. There is no evidence of any great hostility towards the church and its institutions before the Reformation. On the contrary, both the English episcopate and parish clergy seem to have been, by the standards of other European lands, both well-trained and living without scandal. On the other hand, few were prepared to defy the king to defend the threatened institutions of the old church, and the king was to discover that, largely inadvertently, his own actions had stimulated support for the heresy he had so virulently condemned in his youthful writings. This was predictable enough. In the campaign against the church, Henry and his faithful agent, Thomas Cromwell, necessarily made use of those who had the necessary polemical armory, and this was most conveniently supplied by continental Protestantism. Several open advocates of the new beliefs, such as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and the preacher Hugh Latimer, attained positions of influence as a result. As Henry's health failed in the last years of his life, it became clear that his own actions had encouraged the growth of a powerful evangelical party at court. On his death in 1547, they moved quickly to establish their supremacy in the regency government, necessitated by the youth of the new king, Edward VI. Thus the short reign of Edward VI saw a determined attempt to introduce a full Protestant church polity into England, modeled on that of the Swiss and German Reformed churches, and driven on by a powerful alliance of Archbishop Cranmer and the Lord Protector the Duke of Somerset. In the 5 years of the king's life, much was achieved. 2 evangelical prayer books, a new English order of service, the stripping of the remaining Catholic paraphernalia from the churches. But time was too short to put down roots. On Edward's death in 1553, the changes were easily reversed by his Catholic half-sister, Mary. Only Mary's devotion to the papacy, which threatened the continued possession of former monastic property in the hands of those who had purchased it from the crown, and her determination to marry her cousin, Philip of Spain, provoked a half-hearted reaction. English Protestantism was reduced once again to a persecuted remnant, many of its most able figures taking refuge abroad to avoid the martyrdom which was the fate of those who remained behind. English Protestantism at least had its first brief moment of success, and Edward's reign would prove an important benchmark later when Elizabeth's accession allowed a renewed return to Protestantism. The same could not be said of either France or the Netherlands. In both these countries, those sympathetic to reform had to suffer cruel disappointment after the evangelical doctrines had made early inroads. Perhaps nowhere was this disappointment more acute than in France, where political circumstances had seemed for a time to be uniquely favorable to reform. France had its own strongly rooted humanist movement, led by the towering figure of the renowned New Testament scholar Jacques Lefebvre de Tables. Equally important was France's strongly developed tradition of independence from Rome, which dated from the time when the medieval French monarchy was the leading force in conciliarism and the sponsor of the schismatic Avignon papacy. This breach had been healed, but the price extracted by the French crown was a substantial degree of control over high ecclesiastical appointments in France, a privilege confirmed by the Concordat of Bologna in 1517. The architect of this agreement was the new king, Francis I, a monarch with strong humanistic leanings, who seemed strongly inclined to endorse much of the reform agenda. His sponsorship of fashionable humanist scholarship sent out signals which could not but alarm conservative forces in France, led by the Parliament of Paris and the theology faculty of the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. So, from an early stage, the battle lines were drawn. The reform-minded, led by Lefebvre and Briconnet, the evangelical bishop of Meaux, sought to pursue an agenda of evangelical renewal whilst remaining loyal to the highly independent French church. Conservatives, meanwhile, tried at every turn to tarnish these initiatives by association with the German heresy. For a decade, the reformers seemed to have the upper hand, secure in the protection of the king and his sister, Margaret d'Angoulême. The turning point came in 1534 when a small group of radical émigré evangelicals contrived to exhibit in Paris posters denouncing the Mass in language of a ferocity previously unknown in polite evangelical circles. The king was outraged and now more easily convinced of the dangers which lay behind the speculative preaching of the Parisian humanists. In the persecution which followed this affair of the placards, Paris evangelism suffered a setback from which it never recovered, as many of its leading figures, Calvin among them, were forced to take flight abroad. In the years which followed, persecution abated, but French evangelism never recovered, reduced to a string of diffuse and essentially leaderless cells, until the emergence of Calvinism in the second half of the century breathed new life into the shattered movement. In the case of the Netherlands, the hostility of the state power was never in doubt. The provinces of the Low Countries formed part of the Burgundian patrimony of the new Emperor Charles V, whose hostility to Luther was intense and personal. Freed of the constraints which bound him in Germany, In the Netherlands, he took rapid and decisive action to inhibit the spread of the new doctrines. This was all the more necessary since there was no doubt that the Netherlands would otherwise have proved fertile ground for the German heresies. The rich provinces of Flanders, Brabant, and Holland formed one of the most urbanized regions of Europe. The prosperous cities of Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp enjoyed both a buoyant international trade and a proud educational tradition. This religion was the cradle of northern humanism, framed both for its high degree of literacy among the general population and the distinction of its Latin schools. It might have been expected in these circumstances that Luther's teachings would find an eager audience in the Low Countries, and leaders of the German movement were not disappointed. In the first 2 decades of the Reformation, there were more translations of Luther's work into Dutch than any other European vernacular. The poorly structured and ill-led Netherlandish church was badly equipped to resist the appeal of the new doctrines, and Luther's teachings quickly found a deep resonance among the urban population. "If there be 3 men that speak," wrote Cardinal Wolsey's envoy Sir John Hacket in 1527, "the twain keep Luther's opinions." A pardonable exaggeration, which nevertheless conveys something of the extent of popular interest in the new teachings. But even so robust a movement could make little headway in the face of so determined an opponent as Charles V. Luther's teachings were proscribed in the Netherlands even before his appearance at Worms in 1521, and this official condemnation was soon backed by an apparatus of persecution to match any in Europe. A series of proclamations made first the preaching or printing, later even the possession of Lutheran books a capital crime. The first victims of the edicts were prominent local preachers who had dared to support Luther's call for reform. Soon most had either been executed, forced to recant, or driven into exile in Germany. The elimination of this first generation of Lutheran leadership had a profound effect on the Reformation in the Netherlands. Deprived of their theological guidance, Dutch evangelicals turned increasingly to visionaries and prophets, whose rejection by the leaders of the evangelical mainstream found expression in a doctrine of violence and apocalyptic despair. This movement, the first decisive phase of Anabaptism, reached its apogee in 1534 with the seizure of the German imperial city of Munster, just across the border from the eastern Netherlands. The proclamation of the Munsterite kingdom had a profound resonance in the Netherlands, particularly in the northern provinces in Holland, then suffering a sharp economic recession. Although an attempted insurrection which would have made Amsterdam a second Munster failed, thousands from the Dutch provinces flocked to the German New Jerusalem. When Munster was finally suppressed in 1535, many in the Netherlands were caught up in the bloody repression that followed. But Dutch Anabaptism proved a resilient plant. Reformed in the 1540s by the Friesland priest Menno Simons, and shorn of its more violent rhetoric, Dutch Anabaptism would survive to mount a plausible challenge to Calvinism in the second half of the 16th century. In his other dominions, Luther's movement would not cause Charles V the same problems. Spain was always likely to prove unfertile territory for Protestantism, since this was a land where memories of the struggle to reclaim the Spanish mainland from the Moors were still fresh. The conquest of Granada, completed in 1492, was heralded in the peninsula as the Catholic monarch's greatest victory, and undoubtedly helped create a strong sense of identification between the Catholic Church and the developing self-identity of the new Spanish kingdom. Another important remnant of that period was the Spanish Inquisition, created as a means of testing the sincerity of those of other religions. Moors or Jews who had converted to Christianity in order to stay in Spain, but equally easily turned against the rare individuals who showed signs of sympathy for the new heresies. A more interesting case was that of the Italian peninsula. Here, a robust response to Luther's call for reform might well have been expected. The proud city-states of northern Italy were not much different from the German imperial cities in their traditions of political independence, and over much of the peninsula, relations with the papacy were extremely tense. Many Italian churchmen were prepared to speak out at the slow pace of papally sponsored reform and the cynical exploitation of papal power for political ends that had characterized much of the 15th century. It was probably also in Italy that theologians engaged most directly with Luther's doctrine of justification by faith. Since his reformulation of the doctrine of salvation commended itself to several leading figures on the reform wing of Italian Catholicism. Right up until the first session of the Council of Trent, men such as Reginald Pole and Gasparo Contarini hoped to persuade their colleagues that agreement on this central Protestant doctrine offered the basis of possible reconciliation between the two churches. But Italian evangelism failed to live up to these promising beginnings. Nowhere apparently did Luther's call for reform produce the same popular resonance as in parts of northern Europe. Italian evangelism remained an elite movement, and those church leaders who favored doctrinal engagement with Lutheranism were too bound up with the institutional church to follow the Germans into a repudiation of papal authority. Perhaps also cultural snobbery played its part. Living in the cradle of humanism and the Renaissance, Italians were reluctant to concede that the reform of the church could proceed according to an intellectual agenda emanating from the barbarous north. However, the polite evangelism of Italy made little progress against the entrenched forces of the church hierarchy. The decisive movement came in 1542, when two prominent leaders of Italian reform, Bernardino Ochino and Pietro Martyr Vermigli, abandoned their charges and fled abroad. Henceforth, Italians would, like Ochino and Martyr, make their most substantial contribution to evangelical reform from outside the peninsula, many of them attaining notoriety as free thinkers and dissidents on the very margins of the mainstream Protestant churches. In many lands of Europe, like Italy, the 1540s was a decade of retreat for Protestantism. After the optimistic evangelism of the 1520s, followed by a decade of consolidation, the movement suffered substantial reverses in the middle years of the century. In France, Italy, and the Netherlands, promising beginnings had now given way to repression, which forced all of those who wished openly to espouse the evangelical doctrines to seek safer climes elsewhere. Many chose the safer course of conformity. Even in Germany, the situation was far from rosy. Luther's death in 1546 was followed by a determined effort to subdue German Protestantism by force, as the emperor finally took to arms in the Schmalkaldic War. The result was a smashing defeat for the Protestant princes, which seemed at one point likely to reverse 2 decades of systematic church building in the German princely states. Even before this, many even of the reformers had begun to question how far these German churches had progressed with the fundamental renovation of the Christian life, which had been at the heart of Luther's call for reform. The Reformation, it seemed, was badly in need of a second wind. Calvinism and religious warfare in the second half of the 16th century. The salvation of Protestantism came from what might at first sight have seemed an unlikely source. Geneva was at this point a small French-speaking enclave surrounded by 3 powerful neighbors. To the north and west, France and Savoy; to the east, the Swiss Confederation. A latecomer to the Reformation, the city's population converted to Protestantism in consequence of a citizen rebellion intended to free itself from the control of its local bishop. For a decade or more, the small city remained very much in the shadow of the larger Swiss Protestant powers. Bern, its heavy-handed protector and sponsor of the Revolution of 1532, and Zurich, beacon of evangelical reform both within and beyond the Confederation. Its transformation from this lowly and essentially provincial status owed everything to the clear-minded vision of John Calvin, a French refugee who first came to Geneva, intending nothing more than a rapid passage onto a more substantial center of evangelical scholarship, but who remained to transform the city and its international influence. John Calvin was, by any reckoning, a remarkable man. Born in Nyon, Picardy, in 1509, he was very much a figure of the second generation, graduating through a conventional education to the humanist circle, which flirted with evangelism in Paris in the early 1530s. Forced to leave France by the persecution which erupted in the wake of the affair of the Placards, 1534, Calvin now turned his considerable intellectual skills to a justification of French evangelism, which Francis I was attempting to demonize to justify his recent harsh repression. The result was the first version of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, an exposition of the new evangelical faith remarkable for its clarity and lucidity of expression. It was the spreading reputation of this book which persuaded Guillaume Farel, the first reformer of Geneva, to detain Calvin to assist him with the work of reformation, when Calvin passed through the city in 1536. The first ministry was not a success. A stranger to the Swiss Confederation and to Geneva's Byzantine factional politics, Calvin was in 1538 outmaneuvered and expelled, though he quickly found new employment as minister to the small French congregation in Martin Bucer's Strasbourg. Calvin profited greatly from this interlude, taking the opportunity to clarify his ideas of church organization in one of the greatest of the German Protestant cities. When he returned to Geneva in 1541, he did so very much on his own terms, as the undisputed master of the Genevan reform. Calvin's recall gave him the opportunity to create in the city his own vision of the Reformed church community, not without opposition, but with the steely determination which would characterize all his enterprises. Calvin introduced the best of what he had observed in Germany and his own small French church in Strasbourg, regular preaching and catechismal instruction for children and adults alike, combined with close regulation of the business and moral life of the community. The cornerstone of the enterprise was the cooperation of a close band of like-minded ministerial colleagues, all of them like himself exiles from France, and the consistory, a new institution made up of equal numbers of magistrates sitting as elders, and ministers which met on a regular basis to supervise the morals and religious life of the community. The values of Calvin's Geneva were not intrinsically different from those of other early modern European urban societies. Its peculiarity lay in the care and determination with which they were enforced. For many around Europe, Geneva's growing reputation as a community living out the principles of reform, combined with Calvin's own reputation as a preacher and theologian, made it a beacon of hope in an unruly world. In John Knox's famous formulation, the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on the earth since the days of the apostles. Geneva's emergence as a powerhouse of reform came at an opportune moment. All over Europe, Catholicism was beginning to recover its confidence, and a brake had been put on the evangelical advance. The Council of Trent finally began its deliberations in 1545, and in its first sessions committed the old church to a decisive repudiation of evangelical doctrine. Canon by canon, its doctrinal determinations offered a stark antithesis to the fundamental tenets of Protestantism. Canon 12. If anyone should say that justifying faith is nothing other than trust in the divine mercy which remits sins for Christ's sake, or that we are justified by such trust alone, let him be anathema. Although it would be many decades before the effects of Trent's decrees were felt throughout the Catholic Church, the remaining confidence of the old Church was evident in a much more determined pursuit of heresy in several parts of Europe. Those who had committed themselves to the new doctrines had little choice but to seek safety abroad. Geneva became one of a number of cities strategically placed along the borders of the German Empire to receive a major influx of refugees from the suffering evangelical minorities of Western and Southern Europe. This reformation of the refugees had a profound impact on the development of the Protestant movement. Liberated from the compromises and equivocations necessary in the constrained circumstances of their homelands, these groups of French, Italian, English, and Netherlandish exiles were now drawn into churches with a much clearer sense of identity and developed organizational structure. Many of these exile groups now committed themselves to the re-evangelization of their homeland, and most drew their inspiration from the structures and ethos of Calvin's church in Geneva. The first to feel the effect of this new militant climate within the evangelical movement was, not surprisingly, Calvin's French homeland. Even during the difficult years when Calvin's own position in Geneva was far from clear, he never forgot the scattered evangelical sympathizers left behind in Paris and elsewhere. Much of his writing during these years was devoted to encouraging them to hold true to their beliefs. Calvin's fame today rests mostly on his talent as a theologian and church organizer, but his contemporary influence probably owed as much to his undoubted gifts as a popular writer. In small tracts of remarkable clarity and force, such as his Traité de religie, 1543, and the Excuses et Messieurs les Nicodemites, 1544, Calvin spoke directly to the concerns of these French sympathizers. His correspondence also maintained a steady pressure on those tempted to conform to follow their vocation with courage. For more than a decade, Calvin's energy could make no great impact against the policy of persecution maintained by Francis I and his son Henry II. But from about 1555, the situation began to change. It was significant that in this year, Calvin finally imposed his will on his local Genevan opponents. He was now able to direct his whole efforts to the evangelization of France. Over the next years, a steady stream of ministers trained in Geneva were dispatched to assist the small, secret French Calvinist churches emerging in the larger French cities. The first was founded in Paris in 1555. These ministers were able to form the congregations in the image of Geneva and enforce a measure of central control. The first national synod of the French churches met in Paris in 1559, and although only 11 churches were represented, 9 of their ministers were Genevan trained. By 1559, the political climate began to turn decisively in the Calvinists' favor. In June, the persecuting King Henry II died, the victim of a freak jousting accident, which Calvinists were not slow to interpret as an example of the providential favor which seemed increasingly to shine on their movement. Henry's death left a political vacuum, quickly filled by the ultra-Orthodox Duke of Guise, ruling France in the name of the new king, his nephew Francis II. Guise's domination of government provoked a number of nobles excluded by his arrogant assertion of power to join the Calvinist churches as a vehicle for their political opposition. When in December 1560, the sudden death of Francis destroyed the Guise power base, the Calvinists communities were in a position to demand religious toleration as a condition for their future cooperation. These were indeed years of hope and exaltation for Protestants all over Northern Europe. In England, the accession of Elizabeth in November 1558 brought an end to the Catholic regime of her Catholic half-sister Mary and promised a significant shift in the religious balance of power in northwestern Europe. This in itself was sufficient to encourage sections of the Scottish nobility who had been keen to challenge the power of the French-dominated Regency government of Mary of Guise. In 1559, stimulated by the impending return of the widowed Queen Mary from France, they rose in revolt. Military aid from England tipped the balance in favor of the rebels. A short campaign, encouraged by religious demonstrations, orchestrated by John Knox, led in 1560 to the establishment of a Calvinist regime. It is easy to see why Protestants across Europe took new hope from these events. After a decade of retreat, new life seemed to have been breathed into the Protestant movement. The effect was inspirational, even intoxicating. All Christians in the 16th century shared a perception of God as an active force in everyday events. But this sense of providential activism seems to have been particularly developed in Calvinism. God's providence governs all, wrote Calvin in his Institutes. For he is deemed omnipotent, not because he can indeed act, yet sometimes ceases and sits in idleness, but because, governing heaven and earth by his providence, he so regulates all things that nothing takes place without his deliberation. And this sense of God's active direction of events could easily be applied to the unfolding drama in France. Did you ever read or hear anything more opportune than the death of the king? Was Calvin's reaction to the death of Francis II in December 1560. He who pierced the eye of the Father has now struck the ear of the Son. It is important to appreciate the atmosphere of the day if one is to comprehend how the triumphalism and defiance of French Calvinists drove France on towards religious confrontation. By this point, the beleaguered French crown was strongly inclined to compromise. Catherine of Medici, widow of Henry II and mother of the new young king Charles IX, was by now securely in control of government and could see the pointlessness of continuing the policy of persecution. By now, religious violence had convulsed most of France's major cities. Continuing attempts to control religious dissidents by repression seemed only to exacerbate the problem. So in 1561, Catherine sponsored an attempt to promote religious reconciliation, a conference between the Calvinists and Orthodox Catholics. The Colloquy of Poissy was attended by a powerful Genevan delegation led by Theodore Beza, Calvin's principal lieutenant and ultimate successor. When it failed, not least because of a forthright restatement of Calvinist Eucharistic theology from Beza, Catherine in January 1562 issued a unilateral declaration of toleration. But by this time, events had moved beyond the possibility of a negotiated settlement. Outraged Catholics were provoked beyond endurance by the arrogance of those of the new religion, or as they called it, the religion which pretended to be reformed. Religion Prétendue Réformée, or RPR. Bands of Calvinists roamed the streets, chanting their metrical psalms, assaulting priests, and desecrating religious buildings. In March, the Duke of Guise, the champion of Catholicism, came upon a congregation worshipping at Vassy near his lands in Burgundy, and a massacre followed. Within a month, both sides had taken to arms. The outbreak of the religious wars in France ushered in a new stage in the Reformation conflict. In many respects, the resort to arms was an inevitable consequence of the collision of two new and irreconcilable faiths, a more militant Protestantism, and a reviving and newly self-confident Roman Catholicism. Although the religious conflicts which now came to dominate the religious landscape in Northern Europe were generally preceded by polite requests for religious toleration on the part of the emerging Calvinist congregations, there is little sign that those of the new faith would ever have been truly satisfied with such an outcome. In France, as in the Netherlands, Scotland, and other places where they achieved ascendancy, Calvinists inevitably pressed for the complete abolition of the Mass. In France, this would never be achieved. Indeed, in retrospect, it appears as if the beginning of the Wars of Religion in 1562 put a decisive brake on the development of French Protestantism. When the two sides took to arms, the Catholic majority still enjoyed a decisive advantage. While the Protestant forces raised through contributions levied on the congregations were well led, they lacked the professionalism of the royal army, now decisively committed on the Catholic side. Having lost the only major engagement of the campaign, the Battle of Dreux, December 1562, the Huguenots were gradually prized out of many of the northern towns they had occupied at the beginning of the war. The Peace of Amboise, published in March 1563, set a definite limit to their ambitions. Henceforth they would be permitted to worship only on the lands of sympathetic nobles, and in addition in 2 places in each local administrative unit, a highly unsatisfactory concession for the city churches, since these sites might be situated many miles from the principal centers of population. In areas where the magistrates were hostile to the new religion, they invariably were. Such conditions cut off the lifeblood of what had previously been largely an urban movement. The growth of French Calvinism had been decisively checked. This was not immediately clear to contemporaries. The wars of religion continued in France, fitfully and without decisive military engagements, for a further 35 years before Henry IV brought the conflict to an end with the peace settlement known as the Edict of Nantes. But long before this, French Protestants accommodated themselves to the status of a privileged minority. The desire to convert France, the providential evangelism of the early 1560s, was much diminished even before the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 brought a steep decline. The massacre, which grew almost spontaneously out of a bungled attempt to assassinate the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny, was a measure of the genuine hatred which now divided the religious communities in France. Its effect was to leave French Protestantism bewildered and leaderless in much of the country. Only in the south of France, secure in strongholds far away from royal armies, did the Huguenots remain a force. In the wake of the massacre, the Protestant towns and nobles of this region banded together in a new military and political organization, the United Provinces of the South, which came close to a total declaration of independence from the discredited French crown. Only the death of the last Valios heir in 1584, an event which made the Huguenot champion Henry of Navarre next in line to the throne, saved royal authority in the south. On his accession in 1589, Henry could rely on the support of his former allies, even if pragmatism dictated that he would only make good his claim to the throne by adopting the religion of the majority of his subjects. Henry's conversion to Catholicism in 1593 effectively ended the religious wars, though the negotiation of a settlement required a further 5 years. The final settlement accorded the Huguenots significant privileges, including the right of worship. It was a realistic recognition that Calvinism had, through 40 years of warfare, established a permanent, if limited, presence in the most Catholic kingdom of France. That French Protestantism survived owed much to the extraordinary resilience of Calvinism, but the French Huguenot movement also drew strength from the increasingly international aspect of the conflict. One of the principal characteristics of the Calvinist movement was a sense of solidarity which crossed national boundaries and induced members of churches in one nation to provide help and hospitality to fellow church members elsewhere. The role of the Genevan Church was in this respect exemplary, if not unique. Religious refugees from France and the Netherlands could also rely on finding a safe haven in other similar places in Germany and England. Events in the Netherlands, in fact, closely paralleled the conflict in France. As in France, a previously disparate evangelical movement was revived and reorganized by exile communities drawing their inspiration from Calvinism. As in France, too, the crucial decade from 1555 saw the establishment of small, secret congregations back in the homeland, sustained by the encouragement and missionary activity of those who remained abroad. In the Netherlands, however, the members of the secret churches could not rely on any weakening of resolve on the part of their ruling power. On the contrary, the Low Countries' implacable ruler, Philip II of Spain, was determined to do all in his power to stamp out the new heresies, and persecution continued unabated through the period of gathering crisis to 1565. It was a political crisis which had set Philip against the local Netherlandish nobility, which gave the Calvinists their opportunity. Exploiting a temporary suspension of the heresy laws in 1566, the result of a collapse of will on the part of the regent, Margaret of Parma, in the face of noble protests against her regime, thousands of religious refugees flocked back to their homeland. Mass open-air preaching became the occasion for a call for full religious freedom. Very shortly, the Calvinists took matters into their own hands by descending on the churches to cleanse them of the Catholic images. The iconoclasm, a carefully organized preemptive strike against the institutions of the old church, radicalized the revolt. Although in the short term disastrous, since the nobility swiftly made up their differences with the crown and cooperated in the re-establishment of order, the events of 1566 gave Dutch Calvinists an unchallenged position at the center of the Dutch revolt. Forced back temporarily to the exile towns, the Calvinist communities did not have long to wait for the opportunity to renew the conflict. In 1572, rebel forces invested two small ports at Vlissingen and Den Briel, and Holland rose in support. As the rebels consolidated their hold, the Holland towns became the new Calvinist stronghold of the Free North. This was hardly the intention of William of Orange, who after initial hesitations had become the greatest of the opposition nobles to commit himself unambiguously to the revolt. In the period after 1572, he would emerge as an inspirational military and political leader, providing the revolt with a vital social respectability in the search for allies in other parts of Protestant Europe. William's vision was that the revolt should remain patriotic and inclusive, essentially a struggle for religious toleration and freedom from Spanish rule. But the Calvinists exacted a heavy price for their assistance. As the towns of Holland fell under their control, a ruthless religious uniformity was asserted, the Mass prohibited, and the chief town churches commanded for their the Mass prohibited, and the chief town churches commandeered for their use. And when, after 1576, it briefly appeared that the provinces could unite to expel Spanish troops, the same proselytizing zeal was exported to the other provinces. The result was predictably disastrous for the exponents of an inclusive free state. By 1579, the Southern Catholic nobility had made up their differences with a new and more tolerant Spanish commander, the Duke of Parma. The promulgation of two rival unions in this year indicated what would become a permanent division between a free Calvinist North and a client Habsburg state in the South, increasingly firmly restored to the Catholic fold. For William of Orange, struck down by a Catholic assassin in 1584, the failure of unity was a personal tragedy. But for the Calvinist leadership, it was a reasonable price to pay for the opportunity to create a new Calvinist order in the provinces of the Union. As in France, Scotland, or other parts of the Calvinist International, the towns under Calvinist control, modeled on Calvin's Geneva, soon felt the effects of the distinctive Calvinist concept of religious life. Reformed leaders in all of these lands bent their efforts to a comprehensive remodeling of society. As always in Protestant societies, exhortation from the pulpit played a critical role. But in the Calvinist system, the moral force of preaching was backed by a close supervision of life and morals provided by the consistory, the characteristic Calvinist institution. Calvinists wasted no time erecting consistories wherever they achieved political control. For them, the public exercise of discipline was as crucial a mark of the true church as preaching or the sacraments. In an ideal state of affairs, Calvinists would also enjoy a monopoly of public worship and the support of the state power for the administration of civil penalties to reinforce the moral persuasion of the discipline. Perhaps, though, only in Scotland and a few of the German principalities was this state of Genevan perfection truly achieved. Elsewhere, the ministers found the local magistrates curiously ambivalent in the face of their righteous zeal. In the Netherlands, for instance, the magistrates of the Dutch towns proved extremely reluctant to concede so much power to the pastors. They had, after all, only recently thrown off one form of religious intolerance and had little taste for a new theocracy. In the new Dutch state, therefore, the Calvinist church operated within a system of subtle checks and balances. The church was recognized as the sole public church, but the town authorities turned a deaf ear when the ministers urged them to pursue more energetically the other religious congregations which continued to enjoy a flourishing, if unauthorized, existence. Most significantly of all, neither membership of the church nor participation in its sacraments was made compulsory. Only those who chose joined themselves to the church and submitted themselves to its discipline. Not surprisingly, this was a small proportion of the population. Although perhaps half the population of the new Dutch state attended services in the Calvinist churches, full membership was as low as 10%. But even without the wholehearted support of the state, the sheer moral force of the Calvinist project did achieve a significant reordering in the societies where it held sway. Members of the church would be increasingly recognizable through the sobriety of their dress and through their resolute abstention from forms of entertainment which they deplored, such as dancing and the theater, but to which the mass of the population remained obstinately addicted. And Calvinists, in their turn, accommodated themselves increasingly to this half-victory. In this, they were helped by their own theology, for Calvin's doctrine of predestination made clear that only a small number would be saved. The public adherence of a limited section of society to a severe congregational discipline was in this sense theology made flesh. It was not without cause that non-Calvinist neighbors objected above all to the insufferable self-righteousness of the brethren, even if the social values to which Calvinists adhered were not essentially different from those of society at large. It was in this sense that Puritanism was used as a term of abuse from neighbors less inclined to ostentatious sanctity, but Puritanism, or something like it, was a phenomenon which emerged naturally in all Calvinist societies, for the urge to perfection was a quest in which church members were ceaselessly involved. And, for all their faults, Calvinists could congratulate themselves that they had pursued effectively the renovation of Christian society, which had been at the heart of Luther's German movement and had there ultimately been frustrated. Increasingly, it was Calvinism which provided the moral energy behind the Reformation movement, as German Lutheranism descended into arid and divisive theological debate. This ends part 2.